Well, good morning, distinguished conference participants, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this timely conference in this beautiful city. The last time I was in Riga was in November 2006, when Afghanistan was declared the Alliance's top operational priority at the Riga Summit. Understandable, as for the first time in NATO's history, ground forces under its command were in close combat. Riga was the fourth of 9 NATO summits featuring Afghanistan, and will be on the agenda for a 10th time in Warsaw 2016. Given the use and impact of information in modern conflict, as so thoughtfully set out yesterday, it was prescient of Latvian authorities to establish this facility. There's now 21 NATO-accredited centers, and this is the newest, so I congratulate the authorities for recognizing the need and realizing this achievement. When I started in military public affairs in the early 1990s, Google was a big number. I was smarter than my phone, and social media were reporters who liked to go out for a drink. There were 2 golden rules of effective communication. One was have a message, and second was get it out. It wasn't sophisticated. It was one-way communication with more value placed on the efficiency of distributing product than in effect. In terms of getting the message out, we had different problems then. We faxed our news releases. It took 3 hours to cycle through all the numbers, so the sending order was important. Then several hundred pre-addressed envelopes would be stuffed and mailed, and getting imagery out was even harder. Today, 300 hours of video are uploaded every minute to YouTube. Half the views are by 1 billion users are on mobile devices. Twitter users send 500 million tweets a day. Facebook claims 968 million daily users. And there's now 23 million mobile phone subscribers in Afghanistan, the 51st largest in the world. Digital disrupts massively. So given this breadth of change and the security consequences if we get it wrong, we should wish to be confident that our forces and institutions have evolved to succeed in this new reality. And so does the ISAF campaign offer a window in that transformation. Recently, I've been examining the Alliance information campaign in ISAF from a NATO perspective, particularly public affairs and psychological operations, the integrating function InfoOps, and the relative newcomer to the scene, strategic communications. This slide is an overview of friendly forces in place around late 2009. And who is doing what from a communications perspective. This work is to discern whether the information effort was effective, which organizational structures worked better, to what extent NATO messaging was used, and to what effect. So thoughts grouped in 3 clusters. First, an overview of some challenges to measuring effect. Second, observations I'll call the good, the bad, and the ugly. And third, prescriptions. It is inevitable that military campaigns will be assessed in terms of whether we won or lost, or perhaps didn't win and didn't lose, as this book title selection illustrates. The Good War, why we couldn't win the war or peace in Afghanistan. Losing small wars, British military failure in Iraq and Afghanistan. Power struggle, an inside look at what went wrong, war against the Taliban, why it all went wrong, and why we lost, a general's inside account of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Now, the book, How NATO Won the ISAF Information Campaign, is yet to be written, nor will it be by me. A popular reference was that the West was losing it to people operating from caves, and if that's true, they had one heck of an internet service provider. So what accounts for the view that the effort was wanting? The top 10 reasons often cited are NATO did not have a compelling, easily understood narrative, the narrative was not consistent, commanders were off message, information practitioners were not sufficiently skilled, the capabilities were not organized effectively, the alliance didn't get the good news out, too slow at responding to events, messages didn't resonate with Afghan audiences, insurgents had a more effective information campaign, and media only reported bad news. Now that's a compelling indictment, and for the most part, it's fair, but let's park that list for now. Defining StratCom is the first challenge to establishing how effective it was. It means many things in an alliance that counts 1/3 of the world's nations as members or partners. Is it a process, a mindset, a capability. This is a critical distinction affecting structure and resources. There's also animosity between the constituent parts that are public affairs, military public affairs, PSYOPs, public diplomacy, public defense support to public diplomacy, info ops with sub-functions like deception, and now StratCom. They all jostle for resources, access, and influence. Decision makers wrestle with making sense of it, and practitioners are confused. Our nations are all less secure as a result. It also means matching actions with words. So in a ComISAF orders, let's get some StratCom on this. What's supposed to happen? And what does success look like? And this slide shows the scope of the field of endeavor. I think of it as coordinating what is said, shown, or signaled to help shape what is done in order to inform, persuade, or influence audiences in support of specific objectives. The second challenge is to determine against what the effort should be measured. The extant NATO policy, which is the coordinated and appropriate use of the various functions. The ISAF mission end state, a self-sustaining, moderate, and democratic government able to exercise its sovereign authority independently throughout the country. Or whether all our actions matched all our words. So when farmers grow poppy, or officials indulge in corruption, I don't think it is entirely an alliance PSYOP's failure to influence behavior. And when cartoonists incite and preachers in Florida burn Korans, triggering riots and death in Afghanistan, this should not signal that the public affairs effort is adrift. I think the question to help focus on the problem set is, does fixing that top 10 list with the right comm structure, right resourcing, and right training, keeping all other policy variables the same, now provide optimal outcomes? So 3 points for the good. First, given the policy hand that NATO was dealt for the better part of a decade, the information campaign did considerably better than it's given credit for, in particular at NATO headquarters in Brussels and SHAPE, and for stretches of time at ISAF. Nations frequently did not play well in the sandbox, and often at the expense of NATO. Messaging from NATO HQs, on balance, was genuine, earnest, and relatively consistent over time. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, but maintaining the solidarity, cohesion, and credibility of the alliance was the mission center of gravity. It was a campaign that left almost 3,500 NATO dead, tens of thousands injured, and cost in the order of $1 trillion. Yet at its height, ISAF was a coalition of 50 nations in a campaign longer than World War I, II, and Korea combined, and continues, of course, in another form. Support for military forces and nations has rarely been higher. Polls by the respected Asia Foundation and NATO's own figures show variable but consistently favorable results for how Afghans viewed international forces. Now, public opinion polls in troop-contributing nations started high and declined when it was patently obvious by about 2008 the mission was failing. The figures were better than the reality should have suggested. Nor did polls translate into real public disturbance or serious political recriminations. One government fell, the Dutch. One government barely avoided censure in Parliament, the Canadians. 2 ComISAFs were relieved of command, and in Germany, 3 senior officials resigned. It was very wobbly at times, but it held together for more than 13 years, so something was at play. 4 things stand out. A catastrophic event, 9/11, with the UN mandate, and a rationale for intervention that, at first, was easily understood by contributing nations. Broad-based elite consensus in those nations for more than a decade, and lots of good news stories. I don't mean as a regular news item in major media that opinion leaders were reading or watching. Rather, stories of success and good deeds were found in the thousands of schools, legions, ballparks, arenas, and hometown media coverage as veterans shared their experiences. This huge alliance-wide military outreach effort was a major force that sustained the campaign. Now, the effort by most practitioners in theater was commendable, to be sure, but a large measure of the success we wish to admit is due mainly to a very small number of people, the civilian staff and long-term contractors at NATO headquarters, some of whom fought the information campaign almost from the beginning. They obtained a deep understanding of the operating environment. They built relationships in and outside of theater with media, influencers, and media shapers. They provided valuable continuity at pole mill levels from Brussels and Kabul and effected value-added liaison, including messaging with national capitals. It was a focused effort, if not richly resourced. They guided, shaped, cajoled, and mentored practitioners, many having deployed to theater with no background in the information field. They had a NATO agenda with NATO messaging. Now contrast that with theater. Excepting the last quarter of 2014, President Karzai served throughout ISAF's existence. During that period, there were 16 COM-ISAFs from 7 countries and 11 commanders of RC South, 17 if you include when that area was split in 2. There are 4 SecGens, 5 SecErs, 9 US ambassadors, 8 British and 8 Canadian ambassadors. When the NATO senior civilian representative spokesperson in Kabul left after 3 years in post, he'd worked for 3 ambassadors, 4 commanders with 3 ISAF spokespersons, 5 military heads of communication, and his UN counterpart had changed 3 times. Now this in a complex setting where time in is key to understanding. All too often, nations had national agendas with national messaging. Good point number 2. Synchronizing the efforts of information-related capabilities by grouping them all together in a StratCom structure led by a general officer elicits better outcomes than alternative structures. Third was the tremendous proliferation of a professional and competitive Afghan media and the newly established ability of the Afghan government and institutions to communicate with its citizens. NATO helped facilitate this, including building PSYOPs capability in the Afghan army through public affairs efforts with ministries and support to establish the Government Media Information Center. Enabling effective host nation capability in public communications is a big part of any successful drawdown or exit strategy. The bad. First, frequently actions did not match words, so the info effort regularly fell apart at the policy level. The key principles of war, including unity of effort, or comprehensive approach, and unity of command, started almost a decade in. The inability to reconcile ISAF and Operation Enduring Freedom with their different missions and how to publicly deal with Afghan civilian casualties, in my view, was the most decisive shortcoming in the military and information effort. On this point, former U.S. Secretary of Defense Gates has written, "I did not get this and other command problems in Afghanistan fully fixed until 2010. I should have seized control of the matter well before that. It was my biggest mistake in overseeing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan." Secondly, is the regrettable habit of sexing up the dossier to make interventions more palatable to skeptical publics, to generate and sustain public or political support. It's about democracy. It's not war. It's about self-sufficiency. We aim to defeat the Taliban. It sets unreasonable expectations about what success looks like and the timeline for that. It hurts credibility and gives the insurgent the upper hand in the information space. In this regard, a lot of military communications would benefit from a civilian filter. Military leaders are so can-do, they're relentlessly optimistic, and they're reporting on their own performance. Third is how near-run a thing it was and how long it took to turn the tide. Expansion to the south and east in 2006 exposed deep fissures in force-generation, caveats, and the specter, if not the fact, of a two-tiered alliance. The turnaround began only in mid-2009 with General McChrystal's assessment, the momentum of his command, and President Obama's explanation of the U.S. policy review later that year. This combination was, for the first time, an honest overview, a cogent narrative, and a detailed plan supported by an influential, vocal stakeholder community. It's changed how the mission operated and was perceived, including elevating the role, focus, and resourcing of the information campaign at ISAF HQ to the tune of 175 uniformed people and a $260 million budget, 90% of that America. The ugly. First, we knew better. Afghanistan offers little in terms of StratCom lessons not already known. When putting the first NATO-led command together in 2003, for instance, military authorities told the force commander to plan for an 85-person headquarters, that a J5 planning function wasn't required in theater, and the communications staff would be one major. that grew only at the insistence of nations with the most to lose that tour. Second, where was everybody else? Few national leaders made communicating the mission an ongoing priority. The capacity of civilians at reconstruction teams to explain what they were doing was seriously deficient. And it wasn't until about 2008 that the Afghan government started having real capacity to reach out nationwide. With NATO military often the lone voice, everything looked and sounded like a military problem. And third, you can't lose all the battles and expect StratCom to win the war. It's not some magic pixie dust to sprinkle on to make things better. As Christopher Paul from RAND explains, good StratCom should be the partner of good strategy to make sure that everything you do contributes towards your end states, and equally important, that you avoid doing things that contribute to one end state at the expense of another. So for example, when killing one extremist in such a way that it motivates 3 others to take his place. The way ahead. So what lessons might we derive from the Afghanistan experience? Our top 10 list, it's important, but it's too simple a calculus. Improving StratCom outcomes needs to start with better policy, greater understanding of audiences, including motivations, and conducting operations following established and successful military principles. In limited, non-opposed airstrike campaigns, peace support missions, and humanitarian interventions, NATO's communication efforts have been successful and compare favorably to other large organizations. For everything else, including sustained combat, not quite operations, hybrid warfare if you like, or if NATO was to take on ISIS or its affiliates, then much remains to be done, in part because opponents can be unrestrained in putting information effect at the core of their strategy. 3 prescriptions strike me as being particularly important. First, fix NATO doctrine. Not all nations have their own, so they depend on NATO. But doctrine has not kept pace with today's needs. What happens now is an ongoing cycle of revisions in all functional areas as any one doctrine is modified. This is time not spent executing the program. Instead, why not surge all related work as a holistic package to obtain a unified baseline? Then nations should invest to train to that standard. Lose the labels of InfoOps and PsyOps. Even if wrongly discredited, these names have pernicious meaning. They hurt the information effort at home and hinder the ability to work more closely with non-military organizations and theater. And nest this collection of things related to StratCom at a deputy chief of staff level under a general officer or a civilian equivalent, protecting the direct line of public affairs to the commander. Consider reconceptualizing the structure and reporting relationships so that the info capabilities fit into one of 2 baskets, truth and deception, and put the firewall there, not between functions, to guard organizational credibility. Second is build national capability. 4 nations, the UK, US, Germany, and Canada, provided most of the deployed info-related assets, with various countries providing some PsyOps, mainly in the latter period. And the Danes deserve real credit for establishing NATO TV. How is it possible that most NATO nations still do not have a professional, full-time deployable capability related to public affairs or operational communications? Now, can some nations somewhere spare 1 joint strike fighter or some bombs to invest in a more robust, non-kinetic capability to realize better outcomes in the information domain? And lastly, enhance understanding and engagement. By this, I mean more upfront research, behavioral studies, target audience, and social media analysis. Understanding stems from long-term engagement. NATO is a global actor, yet has no information office in the Middle East, or Asia, or Africa. So, in summary, while messaging from NATO nations was often discordant, the NATO HQ information campaign was much more effective than it's given credit for. There are many communication-related shortcomings over time, but unsatisfactory outcomes in theater were a result mainly of Western hubris, a lack of understanding of the Afghan people, and for half the campaign, the distraction of the Iraq War. I don't mean to suggest a fix is easy, it's not. But as Admiral Mullen, the respected former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff wrote, I would argue that most strategic communication problems are not communication problems at all, they are policy and execution problems. Thank you.